All right. We are about ready to begin our final talk for this morning. Okay. I can tell we are very much energized by this topic, and that is a wonderful thing. Now, I want to introduce to you our final speaker for this morning. Very Reverend John Kartje is a native of East Chicago, Indiana. He was ordained a priest for the Archdiocese of Chicago in 2002. He earned a Bachelor of Arts in Mathematics and a Bachelor of Science degree in Physics in 1987, and in 1995 a PhD in Astronomy and Astrophysics from University of Chicago. He also earned a doctorate in Sacred Theology from Catholic University of America in 2010 in the Department of Biblical Studies. Father Kartje has served as a faculty member at Mundelein Seminary since 2009, and he was appointed as the rector president of the University of St. Mary of the Lake Mundelein Seminary in 2015. He previously served as chaplain of the Catholic Center at Northwestern, at St. Thomas the Apostle in Washington, D.C., and at St. Benedict Parish in Chicago. And I have to tell you that last night I apologized to Father John that our rector was not able to be here tonight to welcome him. And Father John said, "Oh yeah, what's your rector's name?" And I wasn't sure if that was just polite conversation or a sick burn, but Father John, we are very eager to hear your wisdom. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I assure you it was not a sick burn. And I said to Father, well, you know, don't tell him that, and the fat chance of that, no. Nor was it polite conversation. If you ask most of our students who their rector is, they probably wouldn't tell you. But as I am learning, because as you heard, I taught scripture for 2 years, and then I was asked to be rector. So this whole world of academic administration is still something like politeness and knowing everybody's name, still something I'm working on. Well, as you heard, I got my doctorate, millennia ago, and my heart certainly pines a little bit listening to the professional scientists. It's a wonderful, wonderful life. So I'm not going to be able to tell you any cutting-edge things, just things that are kind of in the popular press any of you could read. But I am grateful for the opportunity, because what I'd really like to leave you with, my little contribution to this morning, is that the kinds of things you've heard now, I mean, maybe not in the depth that you heard, but these shouldn't be anomalies. These shouldn't be auditorium, one-and-out type talks for us who are preparing to be, and the vast majority of you, I'm assuming, diocesan parish priests. Because I think in the vast, body of work that is the faith-science dialogue, there's an area that is very little explored, and that's the way scientists think. I mean good scientists, right? So scientism, I think that's a bit of a straw man, that it's out there, people think that way. I can explain everything by science. But any careful thinker, whether a scientist or not, would just say that's arrogance, that's foolhardy, and would recognize that person shouldn't be given the time of day, although it's a very prevalent attitude, I realize that. But what you just heard are two scientists who would never be rightly categorized as scientismists. And so just that careful way of encountering mystery, right? If there's one thing that I find is very consonant with, my studies in astrophysics and what I do, maybe not what I do now is, labor union contracts and fixing roofs and things, but in theology or scripture, it's the encounter with mystery. And that is inherent, I think, in the human condition, whatever your job description. And I think there's just a wealth of insight that science can bring to the table in terms of how we encounter mystery. And the humility and the lack of hubris, well, that goes with a good scientist, just like humility and lack of hubris goes with a good theologian. And let's be brutally honest, there are plenty of theologians who could use some humility and lack of hubris. So if there's scientism, I think there's also theologism, to invent a term, and we know that. Okay, so, you know, with obvious alliteration, well, not alliteration, whatever you'd call it, Cana and NASA conveniently spelled similarly. But I want to look at this question of big history because I'd like to think maybe I approached it the way a layman would approach it. It's not a term I'd heard much about. And so I started just by asking myself, well, what would it mean? You know, what would big history mean before going off and trying to read books and watch videos and things? And I think, you know, agree with this or not, but broadly speaking, it seems that the concept of big history, you need a couple of things. One, you've got to be willing to take on everything, right? There should be no part of any moment in creation that you would say is outside the realm of big history. So that's one thing. Secondly, it would seem that there's some sense of determinable order or structure, whatever you want to call it. You know, it's not just a crapshoot. When I look one day, or I look another day, or I look at this part of the universe or that part of the universe. So, you know, you might want to put the laws of physics there, though that needn't be an exhaustive listing. The intelligibility of the universe, you know, if you're looking at the moon, well, let's take something else. Saturn, you're looking at Saturn, where no human being physically has gone and poked and prodded. And you're going to make an assumption that what's going on, you know, something observable 10 billion light years away, that more or less the same governing rules are there. But, you know, that's an underlying assumption. But if you're going to have something like big history, and so not only that that's in space, but that's also in time, and then the last point, and probably the most important, is that there's some sense of, we heard words like purpose, and that's a big word, obviously, but there's a kind of teleology, there's some sense of a directionality. And that doesn't have to be moral necessarily, though some people would, you know, that's what they would mean when they talk about big history. But there's just, you know, there's some sense of things are moving in a certain direction. So that's what I would put out there. I'm sure big historians could take issue with that, or they would certainly expand the list. But I think for anyone just hearing this for the first time, or, you know, the general public, those are some of the takeaways when they're starting to think about this idea of, is there some overarching meaning, purpose, direction, what have you, to what otherwise might seem to be just a lot of sort of disjointed things. So I want to show you a clip. This came out, gosh, it's dated already, 2014. But at the time, it was really a cutting-edge calculation from folks at MIT. And what they wanted to do was, as best as possible, model the observable universe. So this is astronomy we're talking about. And so they took a reasonable size of the universe that they could handle with their computing technology at the time, and they used what were known to be the laws of physics, and they were very honest in terms of, you know, knowing how far they could push things. But what I'm going to show you is, so they set up an initial condition, basically shortly after the Big Bang. So they're starting with stuff, to be sure. And then they just, you know, let this thing evolve in time. And so what you're going to see, you know, this is not animation. Well, it's animation in the sense it's a video, but you know what I mean. It's not Pixar or anything like that. Everything, the structure that you see forming, the light, all of that is the result of the calculation. So you're going to see things like galaxies forming. That's the result of their calculation, starting out with primordial, you know, dust, gas, energy. So ionization, recombination for any of the chemists here. All of this is the product of saying, you know, if we take the laws of physics as we know them, we start off with an initial condition that seems to be more or less what we think, you know, was there at the time of the Big Bang. Then what happens is we just allow the thing to run. And here's what you get.
We know what the universe looks like today, and we have a pretty good idea how it started. With the Big Bang. But what happened in the 14 billion years between the Big Bang and now? How did galaxies, like our Milky Way, evolve? To test our theories, scientists at MIT have built a computer model of the universe. A simulation so complex that calculating it on a single desktop would take 2,000 years. They modelled a volume of space almost 350 million light-years across, a large enough chunk to be representative of the whole universe, but detailed enough to delve into individual galaxies, a feat no other team has managed. The model doesn't just tackle the universe's huge range of scales. It also richly describes the forces at work, much better than previous attempts. By factoring in the laws of physics, and a variety of theories about how gases cool, stars evolve and black holes grow, the model recreates both the galaxies and stars we can see, and the dark matter and dark energy that we can't. The simulation starts just 12 million years after the Big Bang, when things start to get interesting. Dark matter clusters together under the force of gravity. If we could see it, it would look like a web. In fact, scientists call it the cosmic web. Where dark matter is densest, shown as bright pink spots, ordinary matter also clumps and forms into galaxies. Now we're looking at the ordinary matter. Blue shows relatively cold clouds of gas, where stars form. Green is warmer gas, while red and white show hot regions around the most violent galaxies. Supermassive black holes grow at the centre of these. As they gobble up matter, they superheat the material around it, blowing out gas in these violent white bursts. Over time, this enriches the space between galaxies with warm but sparse gas.
In the interest of time, I'm going to cut it off there. It just goes on for a couple more minutes, and you start getting recognizable structures like spiral galaxies and so forth, which is really quite remarkable. But the reason I wanted to show that is, on the one hand, you might say, well, okay, that's, kind of very deterministic. You're taking these laws, you're taking these initial conditions. It's an amazing achievement in computer modeling, to be sure. But is there any sense of what we might call big history in that? There's definitely a directionality there, but it's a directionality that's set, if you like, by the laws of physics. Also, nobody has ever seen that. And what I mean by that is what we see are, snapshots in time. So you could only make a little animation like that by, obviously subsequent calculational steps. When we look out, all we can do, the deeper you look, the earlier in time that you're seeing. But these are just kind of momentary snapshots. And so an uber skeptic could possibly say, well, you're not seeing the, evolution of physical laws in time. Maybe there's some reason why what you think is looking very far back, where the light waves or the photons have just been adjusted in some way, or maybe there's a different set of physics that are behaving out there. So to make overarching statements about the entire cosmos is always going to be a tricky thing. But let's look at something much closer to home. Namely within an egg sac. Maybe some of you have seen this video. This is not a calculation. roots were harmed in the filming of this one. Okay. But in all seriousness, I mean, think of how we, in our classes, now, I mean, speaking to the seminarians, but, you know, you can all generalize it for your own experience. That's not done yet, that's okay. You know, we talk about this is what life is, and this is, you know, the dignity of life, or this is, God created everything. But you see what, call it science if you want, I would just call it curious humanity, what that brings to the table. I mean, Thomas Aquinas would have given his right arm for this, I'm sure. He just didn't have it, right? He just didn't have that capacity. Neither did Augustine. Who knows what we'll have, you know, 800 years from now. But I think it's incumbent upon us as people who, you know, study theology, talk about it, will represent it to other people. If this is the first time you saw this clip, I guarantee you, y'all gonna be standing in front of congregations where some of them have seen it, and probably more amazing things than that. So we're on for this. We're not on for being evolutionary biologists necessarily, but for just having, you know, our timeless truths being informed and enlightened by this seemingly never-ending stream of information. So the word metaphor has come up a number of times in the talk so far, and I'd like to suggest that that really is a very helpful way to talk about big history. But what I'd like to suggest is that big history itself is a metaphor. Okay, now by metaphor that doesn't mean it's made up or it's not true. Metaphors are structuring, they're very helpful. So let's take a famous, life is a metaphor, life is a journey, there's a great metaphor. So metaphoricists, or whatever they call themselves, they talk about source domains and target domains. So the source domain is, you know, the comparative thing you're using. The target domain is what you're trying to understand. So life is a journey. The source domain is journey. You're trying to understand something about life, which would be the target domain. We do this all the time in our language. We just don't often reflect on it. So life is a journey. He got a good start in life. He got to seminaries, kind of bumpy road, but now it's smooth sailing, right? That's talking about the rector, not the seminarians. So this whole idea of a metaphor does not exhaust by any means the truth, or even exhaust the explainability of what it is you're looking at, but it is helpful. It gives you a particular lens by which to talk about or think about. Because once you have that sense of life as a journey, for example, and as I said, this is so much a part of who we are, that it can be useful. So if you say that big history is a metaphor, all that I'm saying is you have to have some understanding of what you think history is in the first place. I mean, if you want to call it the sum total of events, as maybe just the most basic understanding, and historians probably have a much more sophisticated way of talking about that. But if you say then big history, what you're implying, as I said earlier, is that somehow there is this either purpose or directionality or understanding that these aren't just, you know, random events, that there's something that seems to be steering things, if you like. Another metaphor would be what I'll call Christian anthropological life. So life, okay, and again, I'm saying this with a nod towards the audience, right? Christian anthropology, that's not just for Christians. If you believe it, then that refers to every human being who's ever lived. And you can fill it out however you like, you know, that you are in the image and likeness of a Trinitarian God, right? As soon as you say you're a Christian, you've signed on to that claim. Well, once you've said that, that can become a very powerful metaphor. You know, you can say history is life. In other words, the way I understand life is going to influence the way I talk about and understand history. And I'd like to suggest that this idea of there being a purpose or a telos or a directionality probably first occurred to people in their own awareness. You know, now I'd love to have that conversation with evolutionary biologists because maybe that's not true. But that sense of, I'm going on a journey, I want to get from here to there, or reproduction, you know, that's based on some sort of initial attraction. You know, that the first babies didn't just happen by accident. And so this idea that there is, or I have a desire, I'm hungry, something as basic as that. I want to avoid something that's painful. To begin to get that nascent sense of, well, there is a reason why things happen. And that if you want to talk about big history, my hunch, right, I don't study this professionally, but my hunch is that you don't just start, with a tabula rasa. I'm just there, I'm kind of looking at the world, and all of a sudden I see something that seems to be a teleology or direction. I think we come at it from this underlying sense of what directionality or purpose is. Now, the danger, of course, is that you're just going to try and force that on the world, and that wouldn't be wise, and we can recognize that as a bias. But I am saying, however honestly and humbly you may talk about a directionality in the world, that's feeding off of your sense as a person of what something like purpose or direction might be. And again, it doesn't have to be moral necessarily. I'm just talking about the concept itself. And so then the challenge of understanding how big history works is no greater or lesser than understanding how human anthropology works, but that it has to look like something, right? Now, I get it, the why questions are often, what we concern ourselves about more, but I think the how questions are important to be cautious about, to be sure that you're not going to, overly put things in a box, or you're not going to pretend that you can describe, really complicated things that are not entirely knowable. There's always going to be some element to that. But at the end of the day, we are on for thinking about how the why turns into the how, right? I like to say where the metaphysical rubber hits the physical road. I remember once being in a conversation with John, is it Hout? How does he pronounce his last name? Hout, yeah. Is fascinating man. If you're interested in this topic of religion and science, a very prolific author. And he was talking about, this idea in the context of cosmology, that there does seem to be, and he was talking about consonants, right, just as we heard here. He wasn't saying this proves the existence of God, but that at one level there does seem to be like maybe there is some kind of directionality in the wider cosmos. And I remember, just asking, okay, and I, talk about the difference between primary and secondary causes and so forth. You don't have to say that God is, pushing galaxies around with his index finger. But at some level, if there is this sort of teleological directionality, how is that leading to, clump of gas X behaving in this particular way? And you might say, well, God sets up the laws of physics and then it unfolds, and that's why you see what you're seeing. But still, if you want to say, well, why are the laws of physics set up that way? How does God's overarching desire lead to that production of the laws of physics? You might say, well, that's just the way it is. But if you push it so far, are you, putting it in a box where you just wind up saying, well, the structure of the universe that we have, that is God. God is the ground of being, right? That's what we often hear. But a lot of careful thinking scientists will sometimes say, well, if you want to call that God, okay, but that doesn't sound to me like who you were praying to on your knees last night. Now, there are ways around that, but my point is we are on for engaging that kind of conversation. And if we always want to just keep a step back between what God is responsible for and how that's actually unfolding, I think we're doing ourselves a disservice. We are on for that. Maybe cosmologists aren't on for that, but we are. And we need to be on for it at a kind of boots hit the ground level, right? Because not everyone is going to go to a talk by a professional theologian. They're going to hit you when they're coming out of Mass, after they comment on the Cardinals or whoever team people root for here. So what we know about Christian anthropology or soteriology, right, salvation, can we somehow use that to fill out this idea of big history? Now, I say that very cautiously, right, because I'm not trying to say oh, if you see a galaxy behaving in this way, therefore Jesus died for our sins. But you've got to have this understanding of, and you may hear some things like that, but you've got to have this understanding of, well, what does a redeemed creation mean? What does it look like? Think of all those wonderful Pauline statements. And I think we should give Paul credit, right? I mean, he really meant something by that. So what does a redeemed creation, what does a new creation, a new heaven, a new earth? And what I'm saying is, theologians, you spend a lot of time thinking about what redemption means for people. You spend a lot of time thinking about what salvation means. You read what's been written about those terms, over 2,000 years and before. So the value of a metaphor is you take what you know about the source domain and you try to leverage that as best you can, right, to get insights into that target domain. Life is a journey. Well, I know a lot about journeys. I don't know a lot about life. So can I take that understanding of journey, and I'm not going to put the knowledge of life in a box, but still, there's a lot we draw from that. Our whole understanding of life as a journey, that's pretty operative for many people. So can we take the way we talk about some of these terms in our humanity, in our church, to get a sense of what big history then ought to mean or ought to look like, so that we're not constantly backpedaling and sort of just saying, well, but it doesn't look like this, or I don't want to push it that far, or it doesn't necessarily mean that, because you're going to get lots of looks and, well, what does it mean? And if we talk about, well, there's sort of an overarching, spirit that is, and I'm just saying to try and not tighten it down so much that it's meaningless, nor to be prideful and pretend that you've got this thing entirely figured out. But what I love about good science and good theology is that they're not afraid to engage those kinds of questions, right? And that's why DOSER, if you don't know what that is, but this program, which exists under the aegis of the American Association of Advancement of Sciences, is really so valuable because you're taking, top shelf scientists and you're bringing them into settings like this. But as I said before, my frustration with the seminary system is that these kinds of things often get relegated maybe to an elective or talks now and then, as wonderful as they are. But we need to be engaging that bigger question on a regular basis. So taking that, go back to the newt, right, the evolving newt. Well, I can see that. I can measure that, right? There's no... As amazing as it is and as maybe, leading us into deeper truths that we can't fully comprehend, but still, it's right there. It's the size of a baby newt, for heaven's sakes. It's right there. It's in a contained space, not like the cosmology thing that I showed you. So can I take what I know about that to begin to stir up inside of me these general questions about purpose or life or directionality? Because I've started with this blob and now I've got a newt, right? What's going on there? Well, let's look at physiognomy, right? Facial appearances from genetic mapping. And I'm no biologist, but the pictures amaze me. So you take a blood sample and you come up with a prediction of facial features. Now, obviously, this is a result of building up libraries of facial features, with genetic mapping and so forth. But from the blood sample, you make a prediction. Well, what did the person whose blood that was actually look like? Not exact, but pretty darn close. A lot of features there are mapped. Maybe they just got lucky. So here's a prediction. And there's what you get. That's what the person actually looked like. So racial agreements, obviously. Well, maybe they just got really lucky. Last one. Okay. Reason I'm showing that is, again, to start thinking about something that can be handled and relatively controlled, not controlled in a bad sense, but I've got it right here. I'm not, postulating on what's going on 14 billion light years away. And so as you start to see what is actually knowable, or the monkeys, right? They weren't monkeys. What were they? Capuchins, all right. Now, you may have heard capuchins, but you shouldn't have. If you're going to get me for making fun of other rectors, you know. But when you see that, right, something stirs up. The questions that come to the forefront that weren't questions maybe a generation or two ago. But this is the beauty of, again, if you want to call it the scientific endeavor, I'll just call it the march of human curiosity. This is now raising questions about, well, is there an intentionality? You know, is there a direction? You don't have to come to that conclusion, but the question is enriched, I would argue, immeasurably from where it was before you had, you know, these kinds of data to consider. All right, so for us, take something like baptism, you know? Is that big history? Well, it's, once again, you've got a pretty contained data set there. There's your baby. What science is very helpful with is displacing any sort of what we might now call crazy hypotheses, though maybe not always. So for example, the grace of baptism. Well, what is that? What does that look like? Well, maybe the baby's infused with something. You know, maybe the baby weighs a little bit more after baptism. You know, well, you can weigh that baby. Once you guys start baptizing babies, you'll learn that often babies weigh slightly less after baptism. Now, you can think about that one. The font weighs a little bit more, so maybe some grace leaks out. But one of the questions I love to put to seminarians and priests and myself is, why do you baptize a baby? Now, immediately we can rush off to, you know, all sorts of amazing statements about salvation and original sin. But what are you going to say to those parents? You know, is Christianity just about delayed gratification? You know, when Christ talks about the inbreaking kingdom, why do you baptize a baby? Well, there's grace. Well, what does grace look like? So careful observation can tell us what it doesn't look like, but what does it look like? What is the manifestation of that? And that's a question we should be able to answer. It's a big question. I'm not suggesting, you know, look at the back of the book and you're going to get 2 lines. But it is something that we really ought to be able to tangibly think about and talk about. Because I don't think Paul was just speaking vague abstractions when he talked about, you know, you are a new creation, or he talked about the gifts of the Holy Spirit. Is there a wisdom, you know, the gifts of the Spirit, we could tick them off. Is there a wisdom that you have as a baptized woman or man that you would not have had otherwise? Well, we know what that doesn't mean. It doesn't mean you're going to get a better score on your, you know, SAT, if people still take those or whatever, your theology exam. Okay, it doesn't mean that, but what does it mean? Well, it's biblical wisdom. Okay, well, unpack that, you know, with that richness of what knowing in the biblical sense is. But how are you going to talk about that to the young parents who maybe they're only there because grandma and grandpa said, you better baptize that baby? But isn't that a beautiful thing? You know, isn't that a love-infused decision? And so now you're beginning to tease out that question of a love-based epistemology, right? Of a love-based understanding of grace, and that's not just a consolation prize. Is this big history? Again, it's contained, right? You fit it in a monstrance, for heaven's sakes. Happens every time. Many of us just, you know, we're right there, a beautiful celebration of the Eucharist. And we know how to talk about it in terms of transubstantiation. Maybe a little more than baptism, perhaps, we could talk about, you know, why this matters or what this looks like. But once again, it's that momentary celebration, right? That momentary, that moment in time that taps us into, that plugs us into what we in our sacramental theology, you know, could only talk about as big history, I think. But notice what's happening here. You're going from this localized experience, and now you're using that, I'll say metaphor, obviously here, not as make-believe or anything like that, but as the avenue to talk about the transformed world. You know, you have bread offerings in the Hebrew Scriptures. You have the Last Supper, which certainly is not understood like that, at least in real time. And then you have those early experiences of what the Eucharist was, and all the way to get to this point. But you had to start with that concrete experience of the bread offering. Think of today's readings, right, where we talked about, and thank you, Deacon, for highlighting that, the rules and prescriptions. Well, you start with an understanding of the covenant, which is a very tangible thing. This is Moses and the people, and this is what, the Lord is asking us to do. You've got to, if you don't have that, you're not going to have Jeremiah talking about the new covenant, right, which will be written not on tablets but on our hearts. But that's in the future. The days are coming when these laws will be written on your heart. Okay, so that's going to mean nothing if you don't know that tangible starting point that you've now taken as metaphor for what is written on your heart. Now you have Jesus, the new and everlasting covenant, which, again, looks like neither of those other two, but it's grounded in that set reality. And so if we really want to get an insight into big history, it seems to me, it is well worth putting even more effort into how we talk about things that sometimes we just blithely let roll off our tongues as seminarians and priests, or Christian men and women, Catholic men and women with the sacramental reality. I'm just going to end with one of my favorite theologians, N.T. Wright, a scripture guy. I'm sure it's familiar to many of you. He writes a lot about history, and I'm sure our history professors are here. He does a really nice job of talking about what do the scriptures perhaps mean in situ, right, in their original context, because we're looking at it through the accretions of 2,000 years. I don't have a slide, but he says, start with what you know and then move on from there. So here's a quote. We don't know who God incarnate is until we look at the incarnate God. In other words, you cannot spend too much time looking at Jesus from, the Annunciation through the crucifixion, and certainly we go beyond that, obviously, but to really use the tools of good and proper history, and don't try to force something onto Jesus that, isn't understood contemporaneously at the moment. So we don't know who the God incarnate is until we look at the incarnate God. And then he says, closing quote, history requires humility, patience, penitence, and love. Humility, right? Because you're not going to know everything. We heard so much in all these talks about there's an unknowable, wider context in which we have an insight. All the sacraments say the same thing. This is a moment in time and space and species in which we're sort of tapping into this vast, inexhaustible, unknowable, fully unknowable reality. I know a lot of you guys are IPFers. I recognize your faces. I don't know your names. You read that book by Jean Corbon, which does a beautiful example of talking about the momentary richness of the sacraments. So a humility, to be sure, patience, right? Patience will always be one of the requisite qualities of thinking about big history, to not rush to conclusions, to allow yourself to engage. And that's a quality of good science, that's a quality of good theology. Penitence, to be humble enough when you've gotten it wrong. And usually the getting it wrong means because you can recognize you were hasty or there was a carelessness. We're not the arbiters of absolute right and wrong oftentimes that we can recognize, oh, this is wrong. And I think good science is really pretty good at recognizing its biases. I say good science, right? And it's always going to get better. So when I hear people talk about scientism or these scientists think they can explain everything, well, good scientists don't think that, I think, at least the ones that I've been privileged to know. And I think much better than theologians, good scientists spend a lot of time worrying about their biases. And I'm not saying that theologians don't, but when you're learning theology, and I learned theology, I don't know, how much time we thought about, but hermeneutics and so forth, again, I'm not saying that isn't there. And then the last piece about love, right? And this is N.T. Wright. The delighted affirmation of realities and events outside ourselves and thoughts different from our own. So if you want to think about big history, are you delighted? Are you simply delighted by the affirmation of a reality or an event that's outside of your own perspective and the possibility that that's true? If the delight isn't there, I'm with him on this. You know, you're never going to get the epistemology right. You're going to be a lousy scientist. You're going to be a lousy, theologian. And you're not going to know the name of your host. So that's important. So we'll leave it there. All right, lunch.
Thank you, John. Thank you all for participating in this event with us. It was really illuminating for me, and I hope that you take much food for thought away from this. I want to thank all of our speakers for being with us these last couple of days. We've been enriched by their presence, and we don't have time for the public panel this afternoon, but we will have, as Thomas pointed out, a student representative luncheon for conversation. So we will be getting a chance to have at least some interaction between the community and the speakers at lunch. But I'm going to let you go because I know the seminarians are itching to go. So.
Just a quick announcement. If you brought in coffee cups or plates or anything like that, please take them back out with you. Thank you very much. And thanks again to all our presenters.
We were at the USC together.